My name is Audrey Reynolds, and at 34 years old, I was still seeking my father's approval. After a lifetime of disappointments, I walked into his retirement party with a beautifully wrapped box and high hopes. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe my groundbreaking medical research would finally impress him. Unlike my brothers Wesley and Brian, who had always been his golden boys, I never expected what happened next would change our family forever. Before I dive deeper into what happened next, let me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever felt invisible in your own family. I grew up in Beacon Hill, one of Boston's most prestigious neighborhoods. Our brownstone was a testament to my father Raymond's success as chief surgeon at Boston Memorial Hospital. The walls were adorned with his countless awards, medical journal features, and photographs with famous patients. Every dinner party became a showcase of his surgical triumphs, with guests hanging on his every word as he described saving lives with his gifted hands. My mother Catherine played her part perfectly, the supportive surgeon's wife. She managed our home with the same precision Dad applied to his surgeries, ensuring everything ran smoothly so he could focus on his illustrious career. Mom always made excuses for his absence at school events, saying, "Your father saves lives, Audrey. We can't expect him to leave the operating room for a science fair." Despite her gentle nature, she never contradicted him or stood up when he dismissed my achievements. Then there were my brothers. Wesley, the oldest, followed Dad into cardiothoracic surgery, becoming his protege and eventual colleague at Boston Memorial. Brian, just 2 years older than me, specialized in neurosurgery at Massachusetts General. They were extensions of our father, confident, charismatic, and comfortable in their inherited legacy. The Reynolds men, as Dad proudly called them, were surgical royalty in Boston. I can still remember the Christmas when I was 12. Dad gifted Wesley and Brian personalized stethoscopes engraved with their names, proclaiming, "For my future surgical partners." My gift was a generic science encyclopedia. When I opened it, Dad patted my head and said, "Maybe this will help you catch up to your brothers in biology." I'd actually won the state science fair that year, but he hadn't attended. By high school, I realized I couldn't compete for Dad's attention on his terms. Instead of following the predetermined path to surgical residency, I became fascinated with medical research. The methodical discovery process, the potential to help thousands rather than operating on one patient at a time, it captivated me. When I announced my intention to pursue a PhD in immunology rather than an MD, Dad didn't speak to me for a week. "Research isn't real medicine," he declared when he finally acknowledged my decision. "It's what people do when they can't handle the pressure of the operating room." Mom found me crying in my room that night. "Your father just doesn't understand other paths in medicine," she whispered, stroking my hair. "He'll come around eventually." But her eyes held doubt, and we both knew she didn't believe her own words. Throughout college at Johns Hopkins, I excelled in ways that should have made any parent proud. I graduated summa cum laude, published my first paper as an undergraduate, and secured a prestigious fellowship. Each accomplishment was met with the same response from Dad: "That's nice, but imagine what you could achieve if you'd gone to medical school." Meanwhile, every minor achievement by Wesley and Brian was celebrated with dinner parties and congratulatory calls to extended family. When Brian published his first case study as a resident, a relatively routine procedure, Dad framed the journal page and hung it in his office. My publication in Nature Medicine about a novel approach to autoimmune disorders remained unread on his desk for months. Mom tried to balance Dad's behavior by privately celebrating my milestones. She'd leave congratulatory cards under my pillow or make my favorite meals when I visited home. But she never challenged Dad's dismissal of my career path, maintaining her role as peacekeeper rather than advocate. As years passed, I built emotional walls to protect myself from Dad's indifference. I stopped sharing research breakthroughs or awards, Tired of his responses that invariably redirected the conversation to my brother's surgical schedules, I limited home visits to major holidays, bracing myself each time for the familiar pattern of being relegated to background character in the ongoing saga of the Reynolds surgical dynasty. Yet beneath my developed indifference, a small, stubborn part of me still craved his recognition. That childish need for parental approval never fully disappeared, no matter how I rationalized it away. This vulnerability frustrated me more than Dad's behavior, the fact that despite everything, his opinion still mattered to me. By my late 20s, I'd established myself in the competitive world of immunology research. Colleagues respected me for my work, not my last name. I built a reputation based on innovation and meticulous methodology rather than surgical bravado. But at family gatherings, I was still little Audrey who had never quite fit into the Reynolds medical tradition. At 34, I had become Dr. Audrey Reynolds, lead researcher at the Cambridge Institute for Immunology. My team had recently made a breakthrough in treating a rare autoimmune disorder that had previously been considered untreatable. After years of painstaking research, we developed a targeted therapy that essentially reprogrammed defective immune cells. The treatment had already saved several patients in clinical trials, including a 7-year-old girl who had been given months to live. The medical community took notice. I was invited to speak at international conferences, interviewed for major medical journals, and approached by pharmaceutical companies eager to develop the treatment further. The New England Journal of Medicine featured our findings as their cover story, a rare honor for research not focused on surgical techniques. When the journal arrived, I sent a copy to my parents' house with a brief note. Thought you might be interested in this. Love, Audrey. Mom called immediately, effusive in her congratulations. We're so proud of you, honey. Dad's reading it right now. 2 weeks later, I still hadn't heard from him. When I finally called home, he answered. Hi, Dad. Did you get the journal I sent? Oh, yes, it's around here somewhere. He replied, distraction evident in his voice. Listen, did you hear about Brian's new position? He's been named youngest deputy chief of neurosurgery at Mass General. We're having a celebration next weekend. You'll come, right? That same pattern repeated itself countless times. My accomplishments were acknowledged with cursory interest before conversation shifted to Wesley's innovative valve replacement technique or Brian's surgical fellowship in Switzerland. At family dinners, I sat quietly as Dad regaled guests with stories of his son's surgical prowess, rarely mentioning his daughter unless directly prompted. After one particularly difficult Thanksgiving where Dad introduced me to his colleague as my daughter who does lab work, I finally started therapy. Dr. Marshall helped me recognize the patterns of emotional neglect that had shaped my relationship with my father and gave me tools to protect my self-worth from his dismissal. Your father's approval is something you want, not something you need, she reminded me during sessions. Your value isn't determined by his recognition of it. Intellectually, I understood this. Emotionally, it remained a work in progress. My partner Nathan was my strongest supporter throughout this journey. We'd met at a medical conference 5 years earlier, where he'd attended my presentation and asked the most insightful questions. As a pediatric oncologist, he understood the medical world, but approached it with a compassion that contrasted sharply with my family's competitive drive. Nathan witnessed firsthand how my father's dismissal affected me, despite my attempts to pretend otherwise. After particularly difficult family interactions, he'd hold me while I cried, never trying to fix the situation, but simply acknowledging my pain. Your research is saving lives, he'd remind me, including some of my patients. That matters, whether your father recognizes it or not. When the invitation to Dad's retirement party arrived, my first instinct was to decline. 30 years as chief of surgery at Boston Memorial Hospital meant the event would be a celebration of everything I hadn't become in his eyes. But Nathan saw it differently. This is the perfect opportunity, he suggested as we sat in our Cambridge apartment, the formal invitation between us on the coffee table. Your father will be surrounded by his peers, people who respect medical achievement in all its forms. Maybe seeing others recognize your work will help him see it too. After much deliberation, I decided not only to attend but to bring a special gift. I spent weeks preparing it, a custom-made wooden box containing evidence of my contribution to medicine that not even my father could dismiss. It included the New England Journal featuring my research, the official FDA approval for our treatment protocol, letters from patients whose lives had been saved, and something else, something I hoped would finally make him understand. Are you sure about this? Nathan asked the night before the party as I carefully arranged the contents of the box. No, I admitted, but I'm tired of being invisible in my own family. If this doesn't change anything, at least I'll know I tried one last time. What I didn't say was that I hoped this public setting might finally force my father to acknowledge me. In private, he could easily dismiss my achievements. But surrounded by colleagues who understood the significance of my work, perhaps he'd finally see me as the accomplished medical professional I had become, different from him and my brothers, but no less valuable to the field of medicine. Boston Memorial Hospital spared no expense for Raymond Reynolds' retirement celebration. They reserved the grand ballroom at the Fairmont Copley Plaza, a venue typically used for medical galas and charity events. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables dressed in white linen and adorned with elaborate floral centerpieces. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated backdrop to the gathering medical elite. I arrived with Nathan 45 minutes after the scheduled start time, a deliberate choice to avoid prolonged small talk. As we entered, I clutched the gift box tightly, its weight comforting against my chest. Nathan squeezed my hand reassuringly. You look beautiful, he whispered, and terrified. Is it that obvious? I smoothed my navy blue dress, chosen carefully to project professional confidence. Only to me. He kissed my cheek. Remember, half the people here probably wish they had your research credentials. The ballroom was already filled with Boston's medical community, department heads, hospital administrators, renowned specialists, and former patients whose lives my father had saved. Many faces I recognized from medical journals or conferences, the kind of gathering where my research should have commanded respect. Dr. Howard Mitchell, the hospital director, spotted us immediately and approached with a warm smile. Dr. Reynolds, I was hoping you'd be here. Your recent paper on targeted immunotherapy was extraordinary, absolutely groundbreaking work. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. That's very kind. Not kind at all, just accurate. We've already implemented your protocol for several patients here at Memorial. He glanced at the box in my hands. Special gift for your father. I nodded, not trusting myself to elaborate. Well, he certainly had an illustrious career, but I suspect your generation of Reynolds doctors will make even greater contributions to medicine. He winked before being pulled away by another guest. Similar interactions repeated as we made our way through the crowd. Colleagues approached to discuss my research, ask about ongoing clinical trials, or share how they'd incorporated my findings into their practice. In any other context, this professional recognition would have felt validating. Tonight, it only heightened my awareness of the contrast between how my peers viewed my work and how my family, particularly my father, dismissed it. We eventually found my mother near the bar, elegant in a black evening gown, managing the social obligations of the surgeon's wife one final time. Her face brightened when she saw me. Audrey, darling. She embraced me warmly, careful not to disturb her perfectly styled silver hair. I wasn't sure you'd come. Your father will be so pleased. The doubt must have shown on my face because she quickly added, he will be. Truly. He's just been so overwhelmed with all the preparations and speeches. Nathan graciously intervened. Mrs. Reynolds, you look lovely tonight. This is quite an impressive turnout. Yes, Raymond has influenced so many lives over his career. She glanced over my shoulder. Oh, your brothers are here. Wesley, Brian, look who's arrived. My brothers approached with their wives. Both men striking in tailored suits that emphasized their athletic builds, another Reynolds trait I hadn't inherited. Wesley embraced me with the casual confidence that had always come easily to him. Little sister. Didn't think lab work allowed for social appearances. His tone was teasing but carried the familiar undercurrent of condescension. I make exceptions for major family events. I replied evenly. Congratulations on the new cardiac procedure. I heard it's showing promising results. 3 successful cases so far, he confirmed, chest puffing slightly. Dad's mentioning it in his speech tonight. Brian hugged me next, slightly warmer than Wesley, but equally secure in his position as the favored child. Good to see you, AUD. That's an interesting box, special retirement gift. Something like that, I answered, still unwilling to reveal my plans. Well, Dad will appreciate the thought, whatever it is. The implicit suggestion that the content didn't matter, that nothing I could offer would truly impress our father, hung between us. A photographer approached, requesting a family photo before the formal program began. We arranged ourselves according to the unspoken family hierarchy, Dad at center, Mom beside him, Wesley and Brian flanking them. Their wives next, and me at the edge. As camera flashes documented the Reynolds medical dynasty, I wondered if anyone else noticed how physically separated I appeared from my father. As though my position in the family portrait mirrored my status within it. The gift box grew heavier in my hands as we dispersed. Mom guided us toward the family table at the front of the ballroom, directly before the podium where Dad would soon deliver his retirement speech. Each step closer increased my anxiety. Would tonight finally be different? Had I set myself up for another disappointment? Nathan sensed my mounting tension and whispered, "Remember why you're doing this. It's not about him anymore. It's about acknowledging your own worth." Before I could respond, the lights dimmed slightly and Dr. Mitchell approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats. We're about to begin our program honoring the extraordinary career of Dr. Raymond Reynolds." As applause filled the room, I took my assigned seat, placing the gift box carefully on my lap. Dad sat across the round table, already receiving congratulatory handshakes from colleagues stopping by. He nodded briefly in my direction, but didn't approach. The moment for personal greetings had apparently passed, and now the public celebration of his legacy would begin. I watched as he prepared himself for the spotlight, straightening his tie and adopting the confident posture I'd seen throughout my childhood. Whatever happened next, I had come prepared to finally speak my truth, even if he wasn't prepared to hear it. Dr. Mitchell's introduction was predictably effusive, chronicling my father's rise from promising medical student to nationally recognized surgical pioneer. He highlighted Dad's innovations in cardiac surgery, his record-breaking survival rates, and his mentorship of dozens of surgeons now practicing across the country. With each achievement listed, the audience's admiration grew palpable, a room full of medical professionals paying homage to one of their finest. And so, it is with great pleasure, and equally great sadness at losing him from our operating rooms, that I invite Dr. Raymond Reynolds to share some reflections on his remarkable career. The applause was thunderous as Dad approached the podium, commanding the room with the same authoritative presence that had dominated our home throughout my childhood. At 68, he remained imposing, tall, broad-shouldered, with a full head of silver hair and piercing blue eyes that had intimidated residents and family members alike for decades. "Thank you, Howard, for that generous introduction," he began, his voice strong and measured. "And thank you all for being here tonight. Looking around this room, I see colleagues who became friends, students who became peers, and patients who became living testaments to the power of surgical innovation." He launched into a chronological account of his career highlights, From his first solo surgery to his most recent advancements in valve replacement techniques, he acknowledged key mentors, challenging cases that had pushed him to develop new approaches, and the institutional support that had enabled his success. The crowd listened attentively, occasionally nodding or murmuring in recognition of particularly significant achievements. As Dad's speech continued, I found myself relaxing slightly. Perhaps the evening would remain a simple celebration of his career, without venturing into family territory at all. The box on my lap might remain closed, its contents unnecessary. Part of me almost hoped for this outcome, the confrontation avoided, the status quo preserved. But then he shifted tone, his voice softening slightly. While professional accomplishments are certainly worth celebrating, none of it would have been possible without personal support. First and foremost, my wife, Catherine, who has been my foundation for 43 years. The spotlight briefly found my mother, who smiled graciously as applause acknowledged her role. Catherine has been not just my wife, but my ambassador, my counselor, and occasionally my conscience. She managed our home and family with the same precision I attempted in the operating room, though I suspect her success rate was considerably higher. Gentle laughter rippled through the audience. Mom dabbed discreetly at her eyes. And of course, my children, who have carried forward the Reynolds medical tradition with distinction. My heart rate accelerated. This was the moment. Would he finally acknowledge my contributions alongside my brothers? My oldest son, Wesley, has already surpassed many of my early career accomplishments, pioneering minimally invasive techniques that have revolutionized cardiac care at this very institution. Wesley nodded in acknowledgement as several colleagues patted his shoulder. And Brian, who chose to explore the equally challenging field of neurosurgery, recently became the youngest deputy chief of neurosurgery at Massachusetts General Hospital, continuing our family's commitment to surgical excellence. Brian raised his glass in a small toast as his accomplishment was met with appreciative applause. I sat straighter, waiting for my name to follow. Nathan's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently in encouragement. But instead of continuing the individual recognition, my father paused, looked directly at my brothers, and said the words that would permanently alter our relationship. I owe everything to my sons. They have been my legacy, my pride, and my assurance that the work I began will continue long after I've left the operating room. My daughter. He hesitated, glancing briefly in my direction. She never quite fit into our medical tradition. But I suppose families need diversity too. The statement was met with light, uncertain laughter. Several heads turned toward me, expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. The box on my lap suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Heat rushed to my face as the room seemed to close in around me. The careful composure I'd maintained all evening threatened to shatter. My chest tightened painfully, each breath requiring conscious effort. Decades of dismissal and disappointment crystallized in that single moment of public humiliation. Through the roaring in my ears, I heard the audience applauding a statement that had erased my medical contributions and reduced me to a family anomaly. Some even nodded in apparent agreement, perhaps assuming that as a woman I hadn't been capable of following the surgical path. Nathan's grip on my hand tightened to the point of pain, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. Audrey, he whispered, you don't have to stay for this. My mother stared at her lap, her expression mortified but silent, the same silence that had enabled my father's behavior throughout my life. Wesley at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, while Brian studied his drink with sudden intensity, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The speech continued, Dad moving on to thank hospital administrators and colleagues, seemingly unaware of the damage his words had caused, or perhaps simply unconcerned by it. The casual cruelty felt worse somehow, because it had been delivered so offhandedly, a throwaway line in an otherwise carefully crafted speech. As I sat frozen in my seat, Memories cascaded through my mind. Dad missing my high school graduation because one of Brian's baseball games had gone into extra innings. The time he introduced me to his colleague as my daughter who couldn't handle medical school, despite my PhD from Johns Hopkins. The Christmas he gave my brothers monogrammed surgical instrument sets while handing me a generic gift card. Each slight and dismissal had been a paper cut to my confidence. Tonight had been a slash across already scarred tissue. Yet beneath the hurt, something else was building, a slow-burning anger that had been suppressed for too long. I thought about the patients whose lives had been saved by my research, the doctors around the world implementing my protocols, the recognition from the medical community that had validated years of painstaking work. Nathan leaned closer. "You are so much more than his narrow definition of success," he murmured. "Whatever you decide to do right now, I'm with you." My father was approaching the conclusion of his speech, thanking the hospital board for the retirement package and announcing his plans to consult and teach part-time. The room was preparing for the final applause, the formalities nearly complete. Soon, people would rise for mingling and congratulations, the moment lost forever. I looked down at the box in my lap, the evidence of everything my father had just denied. All the times I had stayed silent flashed before me, each a missed opportunity to claim my place in the medical world he so revered. If I remained silent now, nothing would change. The narrative he had just established would become the accepted family history. For the first time, I realized I wasn't seeking his approval anymore. I was seeking justice, not just for myself, but for anyone who had ever been dismissed because their path didn't match someone else's expectations. As the applause began, I made my decision. The applause echoed around me as I sat perfectly still, the gift box heavy in my lap. My father stood at the podium, basking in the adulation of his peers, completely unaware of, or indifferent to, the damage his words had caused. This was the moment I had always feared and simultaneously prepared for, the public confirmation that in my father's eyes, I would never measure up to the Reynolds standard. I had two options. I could leave quietly, maintaining the family peace as I had done countless times before. We would continue our carefully choreographed dance of strained holiday dinners and superficial phone calls, my achievements perpetually overshadowed by my brothers' surgical careers. Life would proceed exactly as it had for the past 34 years. Or I could stand up. "Are you okay?" Nathan whispered, his concern evident as he studied my face. "No," I replied honestly. "But I might be after this." My mind raced through pivotal moments when I had chosen silence over confrontation. The high school career day when Dad had spoken about medicine but referred only to surgical specialties, ignoring research entirely. I had sat in the back of the auditorium, questions unasked. The family dinner where he had dismissed my first published paper as preliminary findings while praising Brian's case report. I had excused myself to the bathroom and cried silently before returning with a forced smile. Every time I had swallowed my words, they had hardened inside me, forming a calcified mass of resentment and hurt that had affected every relationship in my life. Even with Nathan, I sometimes caught myself minimizing my accomplishments, the ghost of my father's dismissal haunting my self-perception. As these memories surfaced, another image came to mind: Emma Lawson, a 12-year-old patient in our clinical trial. She had been confined to a wheelchair, her immune system attacking her nervous system until our treatment protocol reversed the progression. 3 months after beginning treatment, she had walked into our lab to deliver thank you cards to the research team. "You gave me my life back," she had written in childish script inside my card. That card was now in the box on my lap, along with similar notes from patients whose diseases had been considered untreatable until our breakthrough. These were lives transformed not by surgical skill, but by the research my father had just dismissed as outside the medical tradition he valued. Nathan squeezed my hand again. "Whatever you're thinking, I support you," he said quietly. "But do it for yourself, not for him." His words crystallized my resolve. This wasn't about winning my father's approval anymore. It was about standing up for the validity of my chosen path and the impact of my work. It was about challenging the narrative he had constructed about who I was and what I had achieved. The applause was beginning to die down. Dad was shaking hands with Dr. Mitchell, preparing to return to his seat. In moments, the formal program would transition to dinner and socializing, the opportunity lost. I took a deep breath and stood. The motion caught several people's attention immediately. In the front row, facing the podium, my movement created a disruption in the carefully orchestrated event. My mother's eyes widened in alarm, recognizing something in my expression that signaled departure from the script. Wesley and Brian exchanged glances, sensing the shift in atmosphere. With deliberate steps, I began walking toward the podium, the gift box held firmly in both hands. My heart pounded so violently I was certain others could hear it. But my feet moved steadily forward. The room gradually quieted as more people noticed my approach, conversations tapering into curious silence. My father was still standing near the podium, now watching my approach with confusion. I could read the questions in his expression. What was I doing? Why was I interrupting the natural flow of the evening? Didn't I understand this was his moment? The distance between our table and the podium was perhaps 30 feet, but it felt like crossing an ocean. With each step, I shed a layer of the compliance that had characterized my relationship with my father. The dutiful daughter who accepted being overlooked. The family peacekeeper who never made waves. The accomplished researcher who still somehow felt inadequate in her father's kitchen. By the time I reached him, the room had fallen completely silent. Hundreds of eyes tracked our interaction. The medical community of Boston witnessing what had previously been a private family dynamic. Dad's confusion had transformed into something between annoyance and concern. His public persona momentarily disrupted. "Audrey," he said quietly, a warning in his tone. "What are you doing?" I didn't immediately answer. Instead, I looked out at the gathered crowd, renowned physicians, researchers, and hospital administrators, many of whom had cited my work in their own research. People who knew exactly who I was and what I had contributed to medicine, even if my father did not. Then I turned back to him, meeting his eyes directly for what felt like the first time in years. No deference, no silent pleading for approval, just one medical professional facing another. "I brought you a retirement gift, Dad," I said. My voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "I think you should open it now." Dad stared at the box in my hands, clearly reluctant to create further disruption to his carefully orchestrated evening. The room remained silent, hundreds of medical professionals watching our interaction with undisguised interest. The public setting, which had been the site of my humiliation minutes earlier, now ensured he couldn't simply dismiss me and walk away. "This could wait until later, Audrey," he said, his voice low enough that only those closest to us could hear. "We're in the middle of an event." "Yes, we are," I agreed calmly. "And you just told everyone that I never fit into the Reynolds medical tradition. I think it's appropriate to address that statement now, while everyone's still here." His jaw tightened, but he was too experienced with public appearances to show obvious anger. Instead, he adopted the condescending patience I'd seen him use with difficult patients, taking the box with a tight smile. "Very well." The box was mahogany, custom-made by a woodworker in Cambridge who specialized in medical specimen cases. It featured a small silver plaque on top, engraved with the words, "Expanding the Reynolds Legacy." Dad's eyebrows rose slightly at the inscription before he carefully lifted the lid. The first item visible was the recent issue of the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most prestigious medical publications in the world, with my research as the cover story. The headline read, "Revolutionary Approach to Treating Autoimmune Disorders Shows Unprecedented Success in Clinical Trials." Below that, my name, lead researcher, Audrey Reynolds, Ph.D. Dad stared at it for a moment before setting it aside. Beneath was the official FDA approval document for our treatment protocol, dated just 3 weeks earlier. The approval had been expedited due to the exceptional results in treating previously incurable conditions. The next layer contained photographs and letters from patients whose lives had been saved by our treatment. Emma Lawson's card was on top, her before and after photos showing the dramatic improvement. Next was a 70-year-old man who had regained the ability to walk after years of debilitating symptoms, a college student who had returned to classes after dropping out due to illness, and more, each representing a life fundamentally changed by the research Dad had just dismissed. As he sifted through these materials, his expression gradually shifted from annoyed obligation to genuine surprise. The transformation was subtle. My father had perfected his professional mask over decades, but I knew him well enough to recognize the moment he realized the significance of what he was seeing. The final item in the box was a letter from the hospital board, informing me that Boston Memorial's new research wing would be named the Audrey Reynolds Center for Immunology Research in recognition of my contributions to the field. The facility would open next month, housed in the building adjacent to the surgical center that bore my father's name. Dad held the letter for a long moment, reading it twice before looking up at me. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, confusion, perhaps even a reluctant pride, before his expression settled into careful neutrality. By now, several people in the front row had glimpsed the contents of the box. Dr. Eleanor Franklin, head of research at Boston Memorial and one of the few female department chiefs, stood up from her table. "I'd like to add something here, if I may," she said, her authoritative voice carrying through the silent room. For those who may not be familiar with Dr. Audrey Reynolds' work, she has developed what many of us consider the most significant advancement in autoimmune treatment in the past 20 years. Her research has already saved dozens of lives in clinical trials and will likely save thousands more now that it's received FDA approval. Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. Several other physicians stood to voice similar sentiments. "We're implementing her protocol in pediatric immunology next month," added Dr. Lawrence Ward, Dad's longtime friend and colleague. "3 of our young patients who had exhausted all other treatment options have already been approved. It's giving hope to families who had none." The room had transformed. What had begun as my private response to a public slight was becoming something else, a professional acknowledgement of work that stood on its own merits. Colleagues were nodding, some even applauding briefly. My father stood motionless, the evidence of my success laid bare before the very community whose respect he valued most. I hadn't planned to speak further, but something compelled me to address the room. Not to embarrass my father, but to reclaim the narrative he had attempted to establish. "I never wanted to be a surgeon," I said, my voice steady and clear. Not because I couldn't handle it, as some have suggested, but because my passion led me elsewhere. There are many paths to excellence in medicine. Some require surgical precision in the operating room. Others demand the same precision in research laboratories. Different traditions, but equally valuable. I turned back to my father, meeting his gaze directly. "I may not have followed the Reynolds surgical tradition, Dad, but I've created a new tradition of medical excellence. Different from yours, but no less significant." For perhaps the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty in my father's expression. The carefully constructed hierarchy that had ordered his world, surgeons at the top, researchers somewhere below, was being challenged not just by his daughter, but by his peers. People whose opinions he couldn't simply dismiss. He began, then paused, clearly struggling to formulate a response that would preserve his dignity while acknowledging what had just been revealed. I was not fully aware of the extent of Audrey's work. It wasn't an apology or even a direct acknowledgement of his error, but from Raymond Reynolds, it was unprecedented. The admission that there was something in medicine, something significant, that he hadn't known or understood. Dr. Mitchell approached the podium, skillfully stepping in to smooth the moment. I think we've just witnessed something remarkable, a demonstration that the Reynolds commitment to medical innovation continues, albeit in different forms. Raymond's surgical innovations and Audrey's research breakthroughs represent complementary approaches to the same goal, advancing patient care. Relief washed over my father's face at this diplomatic framing. He nodded, closing the box carefully before handing it back to me. "We should talk more about your work," he said quietly, not quite meeting my eyes. "Perhaps at Sunday dinner." It wasn't the dramatic reconciliation some might have hoped for. No tearful embrace or public apology. But in the context of our relationship, it was seismic, an acknowledgement that a conversation was warranted, that my work deserved his attention. As we stepped away from the podium and the formal program resumed, colleagues approached to congratulate me and discuss potential collaborations. My brothers watched from our table, their expressions a mixture of surprise and reassessment. Nathan caught my eye from across the room and gave me a subtle thumbs up, his pride evident. For the first time in my professional life, I stood in a room where both my father and I were present. And I was not defined as Raymond Reynolds' daughter who had chosen a different path. I was Dr. Audrey Reynolds, recognized for achievements that stood on their own merit. The box that had felt so heavy in my lap now felt light in my hands, not because its contents had changed, but because the weight of seeking validation had been lifted from my shoulders. Whatever happened next with my father, I had claimed my place in medicine on my own terms. The remainder of the retirement party unfolded in a surreal haze. After the confrontation at the podium, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Colleagues who had previously greeted me with polite but distant acknowledgement now approached with genuine interest in my research. Several department heads from various hospitals suggested potential collaborations, and 3 medical residents asked if my lab accepted interns. "Dr. Reynolds, your work on targeted immune cell reprogramming is fascinating," said Dr. Samantha Hayes, a respected immunologist from Chicago. "I've been following your publications for years, but I had no idea you were Raymond's daughter." "Most people don't make the connection," I replied. "Different fields, different approaches, and different impacts," she added meaningfully. "Surgery saves lives one patient at a time. Research like yours changes treatment paradigms for generations." Throughout these conversations, I periodically caught glimpses of my father across the room. He maintained his professional composure, accepting congratulations on his career while occasionally glancing in my direction with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Not anger, not pride, perhaps something closer to confusion. As though seeing me clearly for the first time and unsure what to make of the image. My brothers approached during dessert, both awkwardly navigating the shifted family dynamic. Wesley, ever the pragmatist, spoke first. "That was quite a moment," he said, careful to keep his tone neutral. "I had no idea your research had progressed to FDA approval." "You never asked," I replied simply. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Fair point. I should have paid more attention." Brian was more direct. "Why didn't you tell us about the research wing being named after you?" "That's major, AUD. I tried sharing my work with this family for years," I said. "After a while, I stopped trying." They exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the truth of my statement. While they hadn't been as dismissive as our father, they had participated in the family culture that diminished my achievements and elevated theirs. "For what it's worth," Brian said quietly, "what you've accomplished is impressive as hell. Different from what we do, but maybe more significant in the long run." Coming from Brian, who had never before suggested that any medical field might be more significant than neurosurgery, the statement represented a seismic shift. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tightness I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten it was there. Mother approached next, her eyes red-rimmed, but her social smile firmly in place. "Audrey, darling," she began, then stopped, the practiced phrases failing her. Instead, She simply embraced me, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." I should have said that more often. "Thanks, Mom," I murmured, surprised by the rush of emotion her words triggered. Her silence had hurt almost as much as Dad's dismissal over the years. Her acknowledgement now felt like the closing of an old wound. As the evening wound down, I found myself alone at the edge of the ballroom, taking a moment to process everything that had happened. Nathan had gone to retrieve our coats, and I was preparing for the drive back to Cambridge when my father approached. He stood beside me for a moment, both of us watching the remaining guests rather than looking at each other. The silence stretched uncomfortably before he finally spoke. "Your mother tells me the patient testimonials in that box, they're just a small sample." "Yes," I confirmed. "We've treated 47 patients in clinical trials. 42 showed significant improvement. 38 are considered in remission." He nodded slowly. "Those are impressive numbers. They're people, Dad, not just numbers." A small smile flickered across his face. "You sound like your mother. She used to say the same thing when I discussed surgical outcomes." Another silence fell between us, less tense than before. "I never understood research," he admitted finally. "The pace, the incremental progress. The statistical analysis, it seemed so removed from the immediacy of surgery." "Different approaches for different personalities," I suggested. "You needed the immediate feedback of the operating room. I prefer the methodical discovery process of the lab." "Perhaps." He turned to face me directly. "I meant what I said about Sunday dinner. I'd like to hear more about your work. Really hear it this time." It wasn't an apology, but from Raymond Reynolds. It was perhaps the closest equivalent, an acknowledgement of past failure and an offer to change the pattern. I studied his face, searching for the dismissive father who had shaped so much of my life. Instead, I saw an aging man confronting the limitations of his understanding, attempting in his imperfect way to bridge a gap he had created. "I'll be there," I promised. "But I'm bringing the journal articles. There will be a lot of statistical analysis." His laugh surprised both of us. "I deserve that." He hesitated, then added, "The research wing, that's a significant honor." "It is," I agreed. "Almost as significant as having a surgical center named after you." "Almost," he conceded with another small smile. Nathan returned with our coats, nodding respectfully to my father before giving me a questioning look. I nodded slightly, letting him know I was okay. "We should get going," I said. "It's been a long evening." Dad extended his hand to Nathan, then surprised me by embracing me briefly. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said formally. "And for correcting the record." As Nathan and I drove home through the quiet Boston streets, I felt something shift inside me, not a dramatic transformation, but the quiet settling of pieces that had been misaligned for decades. The relationship with my father wasn't suddenly healed, nor did I expect it to be. One evening couldn't erase years of dismissal and hurt. But something had changed fundamentally in how I viewed myself in relation to him. "You okay?" Nathan asked as we crossed the Harvard Bridge, the lights of Cambridge appearing ahead. "I think I am," I said thoughtfully. For the first time, I don't feel like I'm seeking his approval anymore. Whether he fully recognizes my work or not, I know its value. That's enough. The following months brought gradual but significant changes to my family dynamics. Sunday dinners, once exercises in restraint and superficial conversation, evolved into forums where medical ideas were exchanged across specialties. Dad began asking questions about my research, sometimes basic questions that revealed how little he understood about immunology, but genuine questions nonetheless. The opening of the Audrey Reynolds Center for Immunology Research marked another turning point. Dad attended the ceremony, standing somewhat awkwardly among researchers whose names and work he barely knew. But he came, and he listened as colleagues praised my contributions to the field. "I wish I had paid attention sooner," he said afterward as we toured the new facilities. "I missed so much of your journey." "We have time to change that," I offered. neither absolving him completely nor holding on to resentment that would prevent moving forward. The most profound change, however, wasn't in my relationship with my father, but in my relationship with myself. The nervous researcher constantly seeking validation had been replaced by a confident scientist secure in her contributions. I spoke more assertively in conferences, mentored young researchers with conviction, and even began accepting speaking engagements I would have previously declined. Nathan noticed the change one evening as I prepared notes for a keynote address at an international immunology conference. "You're different since that night," he observed. "More settled somehow." "I realized something important," I explained. "All those years, I thought I needed Dad to validate my path to feel complete as a doctor, as a Reynolds. But when I stood up at that podium, it wasn't his recognition that fulfilled me, it was claiming my own space in medicine on my own terms." This realization became the foundation for healing, not just within my family, but within myself. The need for parental approval had been replaced by something stronger: self-recognition and professional confidence based on measurable impact rather than familial validation. In the year following Dad's retirement party, our treatment protocol was implemented in hospitals across the country. Emma Lawson, our young patient, returned to school and joined the track team. The medical journal that had featured my research named it one of the top 10 medical breakthroughs of the year. And most significantly, I stopped comparing my career to my father's or brother's, recognizing that different paths could lead to equally valuable destinations. The last time my father had dismissed my work, it had devastated me. Now, even if he returned to his old patterns, which occasionally he did, decades of habit not easily broken, it no longer defined my self-worth. The little girl desperate for her father's approval had finally grown up, not by receiving that approval but by outgrowing the need for it. This journey taught me that sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated is not to demand recognition, but to quietly build something so significant it cannot be ignored. The validation I had sought from my father had always been within my reach, in the lives changed by my research, the respect of my peers, and most importantly, in my own acknowledgement of the path I had chosen. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family or had your choices dismissed by those whose approval you sought, I hope my story reminds you that your worth isn't determined by others' recognition of it. Sometimes the greatest act of self-respect is to continue building your legacy, even when those closest to you fail to see its value. Eventually, the evidence becomes too substantial to dismiss, and by then, you may find you no longer need their validation anyway. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself when someone dismissed your achievements? How did you handle it? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that their path is valid, even when others can't see it. Thank you for listening to my journey.